Welcome to Healing Minds, Stories of Resiliency and Recovery, a conversation held at the intersection of substance abuse, mental health, and everyday living. Your hosts, Marc Regala and Justin Wolf, bring both professional expertise and personal understanding to the table. So welcome to the conversation. Let's dive in.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Healing Minds, Stories of Resiliency and Recovery. I'm your host, Justin Wolf, joined by my co-host, Marc Regala. Marc, it's great to have you back, buddy. How's everything been going?
Things are going good. How about yourself?
Hanging in there. Nice to see this spring de-thaw starting to happen here in our neck of the woods. So it's kind of like, all right, the sun is soon to be showing its presence on a regular basis, hopefully.
Days are longer now. Spring is what, next week? March 21st. And opening day is around the corner for baseball. Another
right.
Chicago baseball.
So all that optimism is about to be replaced with just pessimism and just the mantra of like, wait till next year. It's just what it happens. Just
gotta be a realist.
Yeah. Realist, pessimist, I'll call it what it is. I mean, it's just Chicago baseball. So, all right. Well, I think we got a good topic today. And I know this is something that you've shared in previous episodes with our listeners about your own personal experience. And so I think you're going to bring a lot of great wisdom and insight into our topic today of really understanding trauma and what healing and what moving forward looks like when you've experienced such a distressing event or series of events or chronic ongoing events that really make an impact on that individual. And I think that's when we talk about trauma, we are talking about something that is highly subjective to each individual. And to each individual, they can experience the same event. And for one person, it may not be traumatic. And for another person, it may be the end of the world, incredibly overwhelming, and something that totally disrupts the way in which they view themselves, other people, and the world. And so I think that's when we're kind of talking about, because I think trauma, you throw around the word trauma like in our field, it is so widespread, it is so consistently talked about, and yet it is so ambiguous in the term that I think it's really important to kind of dive in there to really understand what is trauma and those various types associated with it today. And I think, Marc, you're going to be able to kind of share some insight into those different types of like acute trauma, which is something that's like very, recent, something that's happened, or something that's chronic. So I think those are really some areas that we can kind of dive into and talk about just the way those events and those experiences really impact the individual. And so I know, Marc, for you, this was a topic that you really wanted to kind of bring forward and have some time to really kind of discuss. And so I'm wondering for you, man, like, what do you think is really going to be important for us to spend our time really kind of diving into today?
Well, before we recorded this, you what's the Webster's Dictionary again for PTSD?
It is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. That is for trauma.
Okay, so what does that mean? I mean, honestly, if you think about it, and you kind of alluded to this in your opening comments, what is deeply distressing or disturbing for you might not necessarily be deeply disturbing or stressing for me. And vice versa. I mean, everybody reacts differently to the ups and downs of life. And, I think that, with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, again, I think as a society, we have an ignorance when it comes to mental health. I've said this repeatedly on these podcasts. I had an ignorance when it came to mental health. I didn't seek professional help until I was in the weeds of my addiction. I was diagnosed with, major depressive disorder, general anxiety disorder, and PTSD. And when I was diagnosed with PTSD, my first response was, I can't have PTSD. I never was in the military, because everybody associates that with the military thing. Serving in the military, what they were subjected to on the battlefield, whatever it might be. And then when my therapist started talking to me about what it actually is, it made perfect sense. When you have stressful events in life, and it could be anything. It could be your parents going through a divorce at a young age, and you're bouncing back and forth between mom and dad's house. It could be the loss of a parent or the loss of a grandparent at a young age. It could be being picked on at school. It could be a toxic relationship, with your partner, and they're a yeller or a screamer and they verbally abuse you. I mean, there's so many different factors that might affect you differently than it affects me. And the way my brain processes things, it could actually cause, some stress on the mental health side. And I think the biggest issue is there's a lot of people out there that have this that's undiagnosed. They know they've gone through some challenges in life, but they never sought professional help. And as a result, you start going down a little bit of a rabbit hole with some bad behavior or some obsessive habits, because it does lead to some obsessive habits. Whether it be gambling as a soothing or self medication, to shopping, to hoarding, and yes, we talk about this a lot: alcohol and substance use disorder. And that's happening because the person on the inside doesn't even know that their brain is reacting to a stressful or traumatic event that occurred. It could have been when they were a child.
Right. And I
Oh,
think that's the part where you kind of like talk about like, hey, these events, they kind of like shake the foundation of our sense of selves, of other people, the world. You can kind of feel like, hey, my belief that people are good and trustworthy is shattered because of something horrific that I experienced and I witnessed or just kind of like, occurred to me. And now I have to navigate this world and I don't trust other people. Uh, my inclinations that I had, like now I second guess those, right? Like I don't trust my internal way in which I'm processing or really interpreting situations that are occurring around me. So it's a really difficult world to navigate when you learn and you start to feel that you can't trust yourself and
yeah,
your judgments and your perception, and you can't trust other people.
yeah,
And so what we want as people is a very common thread. And I feel like that common thread that we all want and we all strive for. And you kind of mentioned some of those behaviors earlier, like gambling, overeating, using, doing X, Y, or Z, like sex, like all those compulsive behaviors that people kind of turn to as a way to try and elicit and really experience some feeling of safety and a feeling of control in a world where it can feel very out of control. And so that's the part, especially when you're talking about the ability to regulate one's emotions after kind of having that experience. That is an incredibly difficult challenge because the one thing that we do know about trauma and those events that are traumatic is that it rewires the brain, which
yeah,
means that the way in which we are processing what is occurring around us has been altered as a result of our experiences. And what we know is that, hey, that part of our brain, that amygdala, that kind of goes fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, it is now activated in a sense of like just trying to help us survive. And that alarm can feel like it is constantly ringing, even when those stressors or those triggers or those reminders aren't around us. So you feel like it's exhausting, right? Kind of like being on guard 24/7 and having this alarm just constantly ringing in your brain. And so that can be like, hey, there's a term in the field when we talk about like, you talk about PTSD, like one of the hallmark symptoms is being hypervigilant.
I think that's a fair statement there for sure. And a lot of times, and you don't even mean it to you don't even mean to do this, but a lot of times it ends up becoming sabotage
Yeah,
because you're just trying to protect yourself.
right. And it makes sense because what's it? Our number one thing is like people that we desire and we search for and we strive for in this world is safety. And it's really hard to function if you don't feel safe.
Correct.
And what We know it's like, hey, like that, what comes with hypervigilance? Like anxiety, right?
Usually goes hand in hand. I mean, I really don't even know if I've talked to somebody like in the support groups or in recovery groups where they have a diagnosis of PTSD, but they don't have a diagnosis of anxiety. Usually it's PTSD and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
PTSD, anxiety.
And it makes sense, right? And I think that's like the most powerful thing you could do for somebody, especially with what they've been through. Hey, based on your history and what you've experienced, it makes sense that anxiety would be here for you, right? Like it's your mind's way of just trying to keep you safe. And I think that's the part, because there is so much shame associated with trauma very often, where it's like, I don't feel like a bad thing happened to me. I feel that I am bad, or that I am defective, or that I'm like this trauma magnet. There's just something about me that draws these experiences, or that for some reason this occurred because there's something about me that deserves it. Right? Like there's all these belief systems that kind of get interwoven throughout these experiences that just feel and feed shame that I know we've talked about before too. And so those emotions can be overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, an example, and again, I see this a lot in our recovery groups that I help facilitate, is it could be either or, it could be a male or a female, and they were in a relationship and they were just blindsided because their partner cheated on them,
Yeah.
and they just felt just the ultimate betrayal, stab in the back, and and they try to process that, and they try to get into another relationship, and again, that's where unfortunately the self sabotage comes into play with future relationships, because they think it's going to happen again, and they're trying to protect themselves, and they're trying to insulate themselves because they don't want to go through that pain again. I mean, that's the best example I can give, and you see that all day long. When you go to like AA meetings and you hear bits and pieces of people's stories, or like I said, the recovery groups, and unfortunately, it goes hand in hand with, again, alcoholism and addictive issues and things like that.
Yeah. Especially when it's like, hey, like that event that happened to me, like it makes it really hard for me to trust myself. So how am I going to trust you? Because putting trust into another person after somebody has done something horrific to you is like the last thing on the to-do list.
Yeah.
Like how could I possibly trust another person after what that person did to me? And that person, because like let's just talk about some of these, like without kind of going into too much detail, but there's a lot of horrific events that occur within the family system and with those closest to that individual, that they had trust, love, unconditional belief that this person would show up and be there for them, only to have that person turn it around and do the unexplainable, the unexpected, and these horrific events. My dogs agree with me. Um,
What kind of dog do you have, Joe?
the most ferocious kind. They are miniature golden doodles.
Sounds, sounds like it.
Yeah, they let the neighborhood know, like, hey, don't you come around here. We will lick you to death.
Yeah, I mean, like, the whole relationship thing. Um, you know, if you have a parent, that maybe is an angry drunk, a yeller, drink, that could be triggering to somebody. Um, like I said, I mean, something as simple as, parents going through a divorce, and, unfortunately, the minor child is bouncing back between mom and dad's house, and maybe the mom or the dad doesn't talk too kindly about the other partner, the other parent of the individual, and they kind of feel like they're caught in the middle. Or maybe one parent is grilling them, "What'd you do at your dad's house this weekend? What'd you do at your mom's house this weekend?" They feel like they're kind of in between because they love their mom and dad, but at the same time, they feel that they got to be answering the questions, and they're afraid subconsciously that throwing the other parent under the bus or what have you. I mean, that takes its toll. I cannot begin to tell you how many young adults I talk to that are in their 20s and early 30s that tell me what an effect that had on them. And that's the
Right.
PTSD.
Right. No, and I think whether it's traumatic or just like incredibly stressful and straining on that individual. Because I think that is something that when you're kind of talking about that kind of dynamic at play, when I used to work in an adolescent dual diagnosis program, that was one of the most common presentations for our kids were that they came from a divorced household, and that kind of back and forth, that instability, really puts a strain on them, right? And so I think that's where you look at whatever it is that people have experienced that they've identified as traumatic to them. Like those emotions are really strong, they're really intense, and what people tend to do is just be like, hey, this feeling that I'm having is a problem. And this is a problem that I am trying to solve right now. And
Yeah.
so, what do people try to do, right? They try to numb it out, and people get really creative in the ways in which they try to emotionally numb. Or if that feeling is so overwhelming and so distressing, what tends to come up for people is like, hey, I can't physically, because in that moment where that event was occurring, I could not get away. I could not escape physically, but I was able to emotionally escape or psychologically escape, however you want to frame it, however you want to tee it up. And now we're talking about the development of disassociation,
Yeah.
because that disassociation becomes like a survival tactic.
Yeah.
I couldn't get through that, so I found a way to navigate this overwhelming and incredibly distressing situation.
Yeah. Disassociation, isolation, and we know what happens when that happens.
Right. And I mean, I think that's something that, like, I've worked with a lot of people who've undergone horrific events in their lives, and that tends to be one of those symptoms that really causes a lot of distress, where like I can feel it coming on, like the side of like the feeling of anxiety, and just noticing it starting to rise up in the body, like, and they're like, I'm starting to pull away, I'm starting to detach, um, because that's the problem with trauma, is that when this event occurs in other context, those ways of navigating the world start to emerge, and they start to show up, whether, and it's like, in this environment that once felt safe, it's now unsafe. And
Yeah.
so now I'm going to respond as such. And that's part of what ends up happening when you've undergone and you've experienced these events, or an event that makes you feel different than other people or detached from others.
And which the brain is just so unique. And again, we really don't know a lot about the brain. I mean, I mentioned this before, but scientists and doctors would agree. They feel that they only know about 6% of how the brain actually works. But I use an example. Like, to this day, if I smell mothballs, it brings me right back, literally, to like when I was like 7 years old, playing hide and go seek in Grandpa's house, and I'm hiding in my grandpa's little walk-in closet because it always smelled like mothballs,
Hmm.
or certain smells of food. It brings you right back, and those in those instances to better moments in my life. But you look at somebody that served in the military, and we use Fourth of July as an example. And I've been to parties where I've had veterans who like refuse to go outside when fireworks are going off, and they're just sitting in the house and they're just drinking one shot and beer after another because they hear the explosive fireworks outside, and it's just bringing them back to the battlefield, or what they witnessed back in the day when they served.
Right.
And that could be anything. I mean, it could be somebody raising their voice. If somebody was raised in a household where there was a lot of yelling and verbal abuse, or in a relationship of verbal abuse,
Mhm.
and again, what makes this so unique is that everybody processes things and everybody absorbs things differently. So what might bother you might not bother me, but what might bother me might not bother you, and that's what makes this so tricky. And being cognizant and observing your feelings on the inside. Like I do that now, but I do that now because I've been educated, by
Mhm.
working with therapists and talking to psychiatrists, and doing the work I do in the community. But 10 years ago, I didn't think there was anything wrong. I just thought this was normal.
Right. No, exactly. And especially if you've grown up in an environment where it's like, hey, this is just how we got through the day. This is what I had to do for myself to kind of, survive, navigate. This is just what we did. Of course it's going to be normal until somebody shines a light and says, hey, there might be another explanation for this.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of leads into like that healing part of this, because I think that's the part is like, just because people have experienced trauma or events that have been highly disturbing, people do recover. And there's a lot of really good evidence-based practices out there that have shown to be really effective at helping people learn to navigate those symptoms when they show up, especially like memories, nightmares, situations, smells, like you said, like all those reminders. And I think at the core of it all, when we talk about healing, it's really learning and building an authentic relationship and reconnecting with oneself is really where that work first starts, because you look at like those safety behaviors that emerge after something unthinkable or unexpected happens. It really can pull us far away from the person that we are and make us act in ways that are inconsistent with how we want to be showing up. So learning and recognizing starting to heal that starts with getting back to, how do I want to show up for myself? How can I show myself some compassion instead of judging, criticizing, being incredibly harsh on myself? Because that's just feeding the pain. That's like pouring salt in the wound, right? And so what for you, Mark, was like really helpful on your journey? Like when you kind of started really starting to heal some of those early wounds that you carried with you, man.
To me, the biggest thing for me is slowing down the thoughts and a lot of self-talk, and trying to shift the narrative in the brain. And again, I think if you shift the narrative in the brain consistently over a period of time, the thoughts change.
Hmm.
It's like a lifestyle or a habit to a lifestyle type thing that we've talked about before. I mean, to me, that's important. Um, if I feel anxious, again, same thing, slowing down the thoughts, try to live in the present, try to live in the moment, realize that was the past, that's gone.
Yeah,
Breathing exercises, um, music therapy, I think was really, really good. Um, I mean, obviously exercise, but that's a daily thing for me. Um, Nature, getting out in nature and doing a walk in nature and seeing the sun and getting some exercise in, but at the same time, just getting away from everything and just gathering your thoughts and doing that self talk. I mean, it's a combination of things, but the thing about it is it's not like you kind of got to go with the flow. I mean, one day might be worse than the next as far as your thoughts in your brain, as far as shifting the narrative, or one particular situation might be more triggering than another situation. So again, I think it's just becoming educated, realizing what works for you, be willing to try different things. I mean, obviously working with the therapist help too. I mean, I always use the example of an onion. You peel off the layers of the onion to get down to the core of what's going on. I mean, that helped tremendously. That allows you to kind of come to grips with yourself and actually start realizing that maybe in some instances you didn't do any wrong, and you got nothing to feel shameful for or guilty about or what have you. That helped. So I mean, it's a combination of things, but it's not a one size fits all. Just like recovery is not a one size fits all. And again, I think that's what makes it challenging. You have to be willing to try different things. There's no book that says do these three things or four things or five things. It's going to work because the three things or four things or five things that I do might be very different than what you need to do.
definitely. No, and I think you highlighted some really key points there when you're kind of talking about like, hey, what works? And like there were three things that kind of like stood out to me as you were talking. The first was just kind of saying, hey, you got to be flexible and doing what works in the moment is really the most important thing, right? Because if it's not going to be effective, then why are we going to do that? And I think that flexibility really kind of flies in the face of a lot of times what happens when we've experienced these unthinkable and just really distressing events where we set a lot of rules in place for ourselves, and the way in which we need to operate to stay safe, and the way the world needs to operate. And so if we can let go of these rules that are governing our behavior and kind of say, hey, maybe those were effective. And I think that's where like that self-compassion piece when you're talking about like kind of reconnecting, pulling back those parts of the onion, seeing like what's at the core here and understanding, hey, these rules were put into place for a reason. They were there and they served their purpose at that time. And over time, they've just become not as effective or as helpful as they once were. So we can start to let go some of these rules that have really kind of, outworn their welcome per se. And then kind of get back to what is really going to be helpful and useful for me. And I think that's when you're kind of talking about like that CBT, really looking at the thoughts, being attuned and aware of what is actually going on inside my mind and how is that influencing the next step or the decision that I'm about to make. And so the more that we can like reconnect with ourselves, I mean, that just goes such a long way in that healing journey, because now we're doing the exact opposite of what we were doing when trauma was governing our behavior and our lives, where it was run, 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 avoid, avoid, avoid.
It's like, for years and years, and I don't know what caused this back, like it was like sixth grade. I'm sure there was something going on inside of me in sixth grade, but my first panic attack that I ever had in my life was actually doing a public presentation in history class about the JFK assassination. And I just locked up and I had no idea what the hell a panic attack was. I thought there was something wrong with me. I mean, I literally got my little 3x5 index cards and just set them down and went to the back of the class and quite frankly started crying. And I will tell you that in my whole professional life, when I had to make public presentations, specifically when I was a manager in the insurance industry, sometimes I would get through them, but probably 90% of the time, I would feel either the beginning of a panic attack or have a full blown panic attack while I was trying to run a meeting.
Yeah.
You have a hard time getting the words out, shortness of breath, this, that, what. I mean, it was terrible. And now in recovery, knowing what I need to do, I do more presentations or public speaking or speaking in front of larger groups than I've ever done in my professional career. And I've spoken in front of probably larger audience than I ever did in my professional career. And I can get up there, I can talk. I don't feel like my heart even skips a beat. I certainly don't feel like shortness of breath, but I get in the right frame of mind beforehand. I mean, I'm doing my breathing exercises and listening to the right music while I'm driving to the presentation. I'm mentally getting prepared and doing what I need to do to get through it. And, by the grace of God, I've, hope I'm not jinxing it because I got to do two tonight, but,
Yeah.
but I haven't had a panic attack speaking in front of groups of people, since I've been in recovery, which is weird because I would have never have. I mean, I just thought that was me.
Yeah.
I thought there was something wrong with me. And I beat myself up pretty hard about that. So I look at that first panic attack as a very traumatic event for me, especially how it happened and when it happened in front of like 30 classmates.
Right.
And it's something that followed me every time I would do like a public presentation or run a meeting or what have you. And now in recovery, again, thank God, it's gone away. But I think it's because I've been educated. I understand the coping skills. I know that there was actually something medically wrong with me. It wasn't just, something that was wrong with me. It just, there's a combination of things that I think led to this point. But that's an example. I mean, that's just one example. But I mean, there could be many other examples out there that people you work with and that I work with that have this diagnosis that are living a life of recovery.
Right. No, and like I think just like what your example is like sharing there, man. I think that's just like it's like inspiring hope. It's like, hey, like just because you're experiencing this now and it feels like this is never going to pass, like this too, like it can be different. Like you can learn to manage and cope and live your life in a different way in which it's been going, to the point that this association and the impact of that traumatic event doesn't steer and direct your life, where you can then, because you're talking about like, hey, like this hasn't shown up, I'm doing these things that really are important to me and these things that really matter to me, and I'm able to go out there and do it and not have those experiences that I had before. And I think that's part of really, you've built a really strong support network within the recovery community that's kind of like helped kind of like have your back. You've done the work internally when you talk about looking at these thoughts and these beliefs and how it's influenced the behavior, the CBT. I know there's some other modalities out there that are really effective and geared at trauma, specifically like EMDR. That's really effective that I've seen like in our workplace where I work, be really helpful and really, relieve people of these feelings of like, hey, like I've been carrying this burden with me where I feel like I'm a burden, and then they're able to let that go and be like, it's because this happened to me at such a young age, and that's not my fault that occurred to me. Even though people tend to own a lot of these events and experiences as something about themselves. And so I think that's, when you're kind of talking, you're like, hey, this stuff ain't showing up anymore. It's because of really doing the difficult work of going through it. And I think that's the part of this too, where it's like these events, like there's no way to get around them. There's no shortcut.
No.
There's no like, short switch where we can kind of just like, never going there again. That's awesome. Like, no, you got to kind of go through it to get past it. And the way in which you get through it, there's a couple different like, paths that you can kind of follow that lead you to the same results of healing in a life that actually is filled with like hope, belief, and fulfillment.
You really want to know the truth, and I speak about this at the hospitals, is the first time that I actually took a pain pill, not as prescribed, against the actual prescription bottle, was I knew it made me feel pretty good, and I know I felt pretty calm on those things. I was obviously being prescribed it for an actual pain in my back, and I great idea. Well, maybe I'll pop an extra pill or two to get through this big meeting that I had to run, public presentation I had to run in the insurance industry. And I took them about an hour before the meeting, and I was feeling pretty good. And it probably was the best meeting I ever ran in the insurance. I have a panic attack. I was on point, and that was the nod that I gave myself today. It's okay to take a couple extra here and there, because that's the disease of addiction, trying to convince yourself to do right. And that's what got me off to the races.
Right.
But it was really self-medicate and not have a panic attack in front of several hundred people.
Right. And it's like, oh, what happens when I don't have any? Oh, God. Now you're talking about like, or I'm running low. Like, oh, Jesus. Yeah.
Severe anxiety.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Like,
it's going to lead to a definite panic attack if you don't have psychologically dependent on it now,
Uh-huh.
That's how the brain works, man.
Yes, it is.
You used a couple acronyms earlier, and just for the sake of the audience, do you mind explaining like what the long form is of those, like DBT? I know what it is, but can you say what that is for the audience?
Oh, yeah. So like dialectical behavior therapy, and cognitive behavior therapy was CBT, right? So DBT is part of like the third wave of cognitive behavior therapy. So really kind of looking at the thought process, but also kind of adding in, that compassion component, the mindfulness piece, the behavior activation. So all of that kind of flows in there. Yeah, I'm speaking jargon. It's awesome.
And you also
and then the eye movement EMDR, right? EMDR, I think is really, it's got a lot of publicity, recognition, and rightfully so, because it provides significant healing and has been shown like, evidence-based to be really highly effective at alleviating the symptoms of trauma and promoting a sense of healing. The other thing that's also really effective and been shown to be really promote healing, and I've seen it in personal work with clients be very helpful, is cognitive processing therapy, also known as CPT. So all those are different modalities that people can kind of go through when working with a therapist to provide a sense of healing and, inspire some hope that, hey, I can reclaim my life. I can kind of get back to being the one in charge of the direction which I'm moving this world through. Yeah. So
And one thing too, though, and when I know we can end it, we're getting short on time, is you know, just like I said earlier, you got to be willing to try different things. From a coping perspective, you, you got to be willing to try different things and everything when it comes to your recovery. So, as an example, I'll talk to people and I'm like, are you speaking to a therapist? It doesn't work for me. Well, why does I didn't get along with my therapist, her or him didn't see eye to eye? Okay, well, did you try working with another therapist? No, it's just not for me. And my response is, well, just like you got to try different coping skills, you got to be willing to try different things when it comes to therapy too. Because I'll be straight up with you, the therapist that got through to me was the third one that I started working with. The first two, I was working with gentlemen that were similar to my age because I thought that would be a good fit, and it just wasn't working out. And then the third one was a referral. And I swear I walked in the room and I said, there is not a chance in hell this is going to work, because it was a very, very young female. And I'm like, what the hell is she going to be able to do to get through to me? I'm in my 40s, married, 4 kids. This woman did so much. I walked in with this pre-mindset of, when I saw her, that it wasn't going to work. And she's the one that got through to me. The education she provided, and she kind of rode with me all the way through me getting recovered and getting sober and so forth, and I'm forever grateful for her. But I remember the first time I saw her, my initial thought was, oh man, there's no way this is going to work. You never know. You just got to be willing to try. Go into it with an open mind.
Definitely. No, I think that's fantastic, Mark. No, so I appreciate the conversation. I think it was a great idea. So thank you for bringing this topic forward, good sir. And thank you everybody for joining in on these conversations that air twice a month. So we look forward to catching you all on our next episode. So as always, Mark, it is a pleasure. And I will talk to you on our next meeting.
I enjoy our conversations every 2 weeks.
Yeah, you better. You better, man.
Thanks for joining us today on Healing Minds, Stories of Resiliency and Recovery. If you're on the journey to find guidance and insights, subscribe now wherever you find your podcasts. Healing Minds, Stories of Resiliency and Recovery is an educational resource, not a substitute for medical or therapeutic advice. The opinions expressed by the hosts and their guests are not necessarily those of NAMI DuPage. Go to namidupage.org/podcast for links to past episodes, show notes, and to submit a question or topic ideas for a future episode. Until next time, be well.